My name is Margaret, and I'm 62 years old. For most of my life, I've been the kind of woman who never asked anyone for help. I was a school teacher for nearly 4 decades, raised my son alone, and prided myself on being strong, reliable, and independent. But sometimes, life has a cruel way of reminding you that strength has limits. It started on a calm Tuesday morning. I was in my kitchen, preparing my usual cup of chamomile tea, when I suddenly felt lightheaded. My heart began to pound in my chest as if it wanted to escape. I remember gripping the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself, thinking it was just stress or maybe dehydration. But then came the shortness of breath, and the next thing I remember was waking up on the kitchen floor, my teacup shattered beside me. The hospital lights were harsh and white when I opened my eyes. A nurse smiled down at me gently, telling me I'd had a mild heart attack. Those words hit me harder than anything. I wasn't ready to accept that my body had betrayed me. The Dr. Wells, came in later and explained that my condition was serious but manageable with proper medication, rest, and a small surgical procedure to improve blood flow. I nodded along, pretending to understand, but inside, all I could think about was the cost. I'm retired now. My savings were meant for small joys, painting, gardening, maybe a quiet trip someday. Not for hospital bills and heart monitors. Even with my insurance, the out-of-pocket expenses were terrifying. Thousands of dollars I simply didn't have. After a few days, when I was stable enough to go home, I sat by my window, staring at the pale morning sky, wondering how I'd pay for all of it. Then I thought of my son, Thomas, my only child. He's 35 now, a successful software engineer living 2 hours away with his wife, Leah. For years I've helped him through every stage of his life: college tuition, down payments, career moves. I never hesitated, because I believed that's what mothers do. So I picked up the phone and called him. My voice trembled slightly as I explained what happened. But I made sure not to sound too desperate. Thomas seemed concerned at first. He said all the right words. "Oh, Mom, I'm so sorry, that must have been terrifying," and promised to help me with the hospital bills as soon as he could. Relief washed over me. Maybe, for once, I could lean on him like he had leaned on me so many times before. A week passed, then 2. The hospital's billing department began calling. I told them my son was arranging the payment, but as the days dragged on, my confidence started to fade. Thomas stopped mentioning it in our short conversations. I tried to be patient after all. He had his own responsibilities, a wife, and a mortgage. But the bills kept piling up like a storm on my kitchen table. Desperate, I started selling things I never thought I would: old jewelry, vintage furniture, even a few antiques that held memories of my late husband. Each item sold felt like letting go of a small piece of my life. But I told myself it was temporary, just until Thomas sent the money he promised. Except he didn't. When I called again, he said he'd been busy with work and hadn't gotten around to transferring the funds yet. His voice was casual, distant. It felt like he wasn't talking to his mother anymore, just someone asking for a favor. My chest tightened, not from my illness, but from disappointment. I tried to focus on my recovery. Dr. Wells told me stress could worsen my condition, so I forced myself to take slow walks, to breathe deeply, to remind myself I was still alive. But every step I took reminded me of how fragile that life had become. Some nights, I'd sit on my porch wrapped in a blanket, staring at the stars, wondering where I went wrong. I had raised my son to be kind, thoughtful, and responsible. I gave him everything I could, even when it meant going without. I thought love like that created an unbreakable bond. But now, I wasn't so sure. Barbara, my closest friend from church, noticed something was off when she visited one afternoon. I told her everything: the heart attack, the bills, the silence from Thomas. She listened quietly, her hand resting gently over mine. "Sometimes," she said softly, "children forget how much their parents have already given." Her words stayed with me. They stung because they were true. I had given so much that maybe Thomas had forgotten the value of it all. As another envelope from the hospital arrived, marked "Final Notice," I sat down at my kitchen table, the late afternoon light slanting through the blinds. My chest felt heavy, Not from my illness this time, but from a truth I didn't want to face. That was the moment I realized my son's love might be conditional after all. When you give everything to someone, you never imagine they'll turn their back on you. I used to believe that love between a mother and her child was unshakable. But as I sat surrounded by medical bills and unanswered messages, my mind drifted back to the days when Thomas was little, when everything I did revolved around him. I became a single mother when my husband, Daniel, died in a car accident. Thomas was only 7 years old. Losing Daniel shattered me, but I didn't have the luxury to grieve for long. I had a child to raise, and life doesn't pause for heartbreak. I took on extra hours at the elementary school where I taught, sometimes working 12-hour days. I packed lunches at dawn, graded papers past midnight, and smiled through exhaustion because Thomas needed stability. He was a bright boy, curious, polite, always asking questions about the world. Every parent-teacher conference I attended for other students, I'd think about how proud Daniel would have been to see our son growing into such a kind-hearted soul. I used to keep a framed picture of Thomas and me at my desk, both of us, beaming at his 5th-grade science fair. He had built a model volcano that didn't quite erupt the way he hoped, but to me, it was perfect. When he reached high school, money grew tighter. Between braces, clothes, and school trips, I often skipped meals to make sure he had what he needed. I even sold Daniel's old watch to pay for Thomas's laptop when he was accepted into a summer computer program. The smile on his face that day made it all worth it. I remember sitting on the couch one night after he went to bed, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. I'd opened a letter from the utility company threatening to shut off power unless I paid the balance by Friday. I cried quietly, terrified and ashamed, but I found a way working weekends at a tutoring center until I could make ends meet again. Thomas never knew. I shielded him from every worry, every late notice, every sleepless night. To him, I was simply Mom, the woman who always had it all under control. And in a way, I liked it that way. I didn't want him to see my struggles. I wanted him to see strength. Years later, when he was accepted into a top university, I thought all that sacrifice had finally paid off. I remember the day the acceptance letter arrived, he ran into the living room, waving it in the air, shouting, "Mom, I did it!" I hugged him so tightly that he laughed and told me I was going to crush the letter. I didn't care. That moment felt like victory. But the joy was quickly followed by fear when I saw the tuition costs. Even with scholarships, there were still thousands to cover. So I took out a small loan under my name. I never told him about it. I just wanted him to have a future I couldn't. When graduation day came, I cried the entire ceremony. He looked so handsome in his cap and gown, shaking hands with the dean, walking across the stage to receive his degree. Afterward, he hugged me and said, "I couldn't have done this without you, Mom. I'll take care of you one day." Those words meant everything. I held on to them for years, like a promise carved into my heart. When he got married to Leah, I paid for half the wedding even though my bank account was nearly empty. I wanted it to be a perfect day for him. I remember standing in the back of the reception hall, watching him laugh and dance, thinking, he made it, he really made it. But now, as I sat in my kitchen decades later, staring at the red-stamped hospital bills, I wondered if that same man even remembered those promises. Maybe Leah's influence had changed him, maybe success had. Or maybe I had made it too easy for him all along, always cushioning his falls, always solving his problems before he even realized he had them. Barbara called me that evening to check in. She asked gently if Thomas had sent the money yet. When I told her no, there was silence on the line for a few seconds. Then she sighed and said, "You've given him everything, Margaret. Maybe he's forgotten what it means to give back." Her words echoed in my mind long after we hung up. I went to my room, pulled out an old box from under my bed, and began sorting through the past photos, report cards, birthday cards with little "I love you, Mom" scrawled in messy handwriting. I smiled through tears, realizing how pure and simple those years were. Back then, love didn't come with conditions. The next morning, I received another knock at the door. I assumed it was the mail carrier, but when I opened it, a man in a brown suit stood there holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Henson?" he asked. I nodded. He handed me an envelope. Inside was a notice from the hospital's collections department, warning that my case could soon be sent to a debt collector. I stood frozen in my doorway, my heart sinking. This was no longer just about pride or independence, it was survival. I had hoped Thomas would step in long before it came to this, but he hadn't. I closed the door, sat down, and stared at the letter in my trembling hands. And then, the first bill collector showed up at my door. Silence can hurt louder than any insult. After that notice from the hospital's collection department, something inside me cracked. I wasn't just worried anymore, I was scared. I had spent my entire life being the dependable one, the one others leaned on. But now I was the one drowning. And the only person I truly counted on, my son, was nowhere to be found. I called Thomas again that evening. The phone rang 6 times before going to voicemail. I left a message explaining that things were getting urgent, that I needed to settle the remaining medical balance before it went into collections. I tried to keep my voice calm, but it shook near the end. I waited an hour, then 2, checking my phone like an anxious teenager waiting for a reply. Nothing. The next morning, I tried texting him instead. "Hi, sweetheart, I hate to ask again, but could you please send the money soon? The hospital's threatening to send this to collections." I watched as the tiny read notification appeared under my message. Then nothing. No reply. That tiny blue checkmark felt like a slap. He saw it, he just chose not to answer. Days turned into weeks. I left more messages. I even called Leah once, thinking maybe she could talk to him. She picked up, sounding polite but cold. "Thomas is very busy right now, Margaret," she said. "We've had a lot going on financially, too." Her words confused me. Busy? Financially struggling? They had just posted photos on social media from their vacation in Italy, a 2-week trip filled with luxury dinners and ocean views. I stared at those pictures, my heart pounding with disbelief. My hospital gown still hung on the back of my bedroom door as a reminder of how close I'd come to losing my life, and my son was smiling in front of Roman ruins. I couldn't reconcile the two images, my struggle and his celebration. It felt like betrayal. Wrapped in silence. One morning, Barbara came over with muffins. She took one look at me and said, "You've lost more weight again." I tried to brush it off, saying it was just stress, but she wasn't fooled. When I told her that Thomas hadn't sent a penny, or even called in weeks, her lips pressed into a thin line. "You can't keep waiting, Margaret," she said firmly. "He's made his choice. You need to make yours." I knew she was right, but admitting that felt like giving up on my own child. I spent nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every memory where Thomas had once been kind, affectionate, and grateful. When did that change? Was it gradual, or had I been blind all along? The bills kept arriving. My medication costs were steep, and even with small payments, the interest grew. I started cutting back half doses of pills some nights, skipping others altogether. I told myself I could manage, but my body disagreed. One afternoon, I was walking back from the pharmacy when I felt lightheaded again. The world tilted. My heart fluttered in my chest. And for a moment, I thought I might faint. I leaned against a lamppost until the dizziness passed. The pharmacist later told me, "You can't skip your doses, ma'am. You're putting yourself at risk." I smiled weakly and nodded. But inside I wanted to scream. If only you knew why. Out of desperation, I sent Thomas one final message. I kept it simple. "Thomas, please call me. I need your help." It was a mother's plea, stripped of pride, layered with pain. He read it. And again, nothing. No call, no visit, no concern. The silence was deafening. It filled my home, crept into my sleep, and echoed through every room. I stopped cooking proper meals and began eating toast and soup from cans. Every ring of my phone made my stomach twist with hope, only for it to fade seconds later. When I told Barbara about it, she shook her head sadly. "He's choosing not to see what you're going through. Sometimes people don't want to face guilt, it's easier for them to look away." That night, I sat on my couch with a box of old family photos. One caught my eye: Thomas at age 10, holding up a Father's Day card he'd made for Daniel. It read, You're my hero. I smiled sadly, realizing I had become the hero who outlived her story. I looked around my small, dimly lit living room, the same one that had seen birthday parties, Christmas mornings, and countless late-night talks between mother and son. Now it was quiet, suffocatingly so. Something inside me hardened that night. It wasn't anger exactly, it was something deeper. A quiet, cold realization that love shouldn't be this one-sided. I had done everything for him, and now, when I needed him the most, he had turned his back. I stopped calling, I stopped texting. I decided if he wanted to reach out, he would. Until then, I'd focus on surviving. I found small ways to cope: writing in a journal, going for gentle walks, praying before bed. But the ache remained, like a wound that refused to heal. Then, one Friday afternoon, as I was sorting through my mail, I noticed another hospital envelope. My hands trembled as I opened it, expecting another payment notice. But this one was different. It was a final warning. If I didn't pay within 30 days, my account would be turned over to collections and potentially reported to credit agencies. I sat down slowly, the paper fluttering in my hands. I stared at my reflection in the window, an aging woman, tired, worn, and alone. For the first time, I didn't cry. I just sat there, numb, realizing that something inside me had shifted permanently. The woman who once believed her son would always come through for her no longer existed. That's when I made a decision that would change everything about how I saw my son. When Thomas finally visited, I barely recognized the man standing at my door. It had been nearly 3 months since my last attempt to reach him. I'd given up expecting anything: no money, no apology, not even a call. Then, one gray Saturday afternoon, I heard a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone. My heart skipped a beat as I shuffled to open it, unsure whether to feel anxious or hopeful. There he was. My son. Tall, sharply dressed, holding his phone in one hand and his car keys in the other. For a split second, I wanted to throw my arms around him, but something in his expression stopped me. His smile was polite, thin, practiced, almost like he was meeting a stranger. "Hey, Mom," he said, his tone casual, as if it hadn't been months since our last real conversation. I invited him in, brushing imaginary dust off the couch before realizing how ridiculous that was. He sat down, glancing around the house like he was inspecting it rather than visiting it. The silence between us stretched uncomfortably until I finally asked, "How have you been?" He shrugged. "Busy. Work's been intense. Leah's parents came to stay for a while. It's been a lot." I nodded slowly, trying to bridge the gap that had formed between us. "I'm glad you came. I wasn't sure you would." He looked at me with mild confusion, as though he didn't understand what I meant. "Why wouldn't I come? You know I care about you, Mom." That word care sounded hollow coming from him. I almost asked if ignoring my messages and bills was his idea of caring, but I bit my tongue. Instead, I brought him a cup of tea, the way I always used to. We sat across from each other, steam curling between us. I told him gently that I'd been struggling to keep up with the medical payments, that I was worried about what might happen if the collections agency got involved. I didn't beg. I just explained the situation plainly, hoping he'd finally understand. But instead of concern, I saw impatience flicker across his face. "Mom, you've got to learn to manage things better," he said, setting his cup down with a sigh. "I can't always bail you out. You've got to be responsible with your money." His words hit me like ice water. For a moment, I just stared at him, unable to speak. Responsible? I'd worked myself to exhaustion to make sure he had everything. Every opportunity, every advantage. I had carried his burdens my entire life. And now he was accusing me of irresponsibility? "I didn't ask for a bailout, Thomas," I said quietly. "I just needed help." "You said you would." He looked away. "I will, Mom, but I've got a lot on my plate right now. We just put a down payment on a new car, and Leah's talking about remodeling the kitchen. Things are tight." I wanted to scream. A new car? A remodeled kitchen? Meanwhile, I was rationing heart medication and selling my furniture to pay medical debt. But all I said was, "I see." He stood up, brushing imaginary lint off his jacket. Listen, I really should get going. Leah's waiting in the car. I just wanted to check in and make sure you're okay. That word again, okay. As if I could be okay when he'd left me drowning in bills. Still, I forced a smile and said, "Thank you for stopping by." He nodded, gave me a quick hug that felt more obligatory than affectionate, and walked out the door. Through the window, I watched him stride toward his sleek silver car. Leah was in the passenger seat, scrolling on her phone. He got in, started the engine, and they drove off without looking back. The house was quiet again. I stood in the doorway for a long time, staring at the empty street. My hands were trembling. But not from my illness, from something deeper. Something raw. I went to the kitchen and poured the untouched tea down the sink. The sound of the liquid hitting the drain echoed through the still air. That hollow feeling in my chest returned, heavier than before. Later that night, Barbara called. She could always tell when something was wrong. I told her about Thomas's visit, every cold word, every dismissive tone. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said softly, "Margaret, sometimes the hardest thing a parent can accept is that their child has grown into someone they don't recognize." I lay awake for hours after that, her words repeating in my head. Maybe she was right. Maybe the Thomas I had raised, the boy with bright eyes and endless curiosity, was gone, replaced by someone who saw me as an obligation instead of a mother. That realization hurt more than any physical pain I'd ever felt. But it also lit something inside me, a quiet, steady resolve. If I was going to survive this chapter of my life, I needed to stop waiting for someone who had already shown me who they were. The next morning, I woke up feeling strangely calm. I made myself breakfast, took my medication, and began writing in a small notebook I kept in the kitchen drawer. At the top of the page, I wrote, "Things I can still control." Underneath, I listed, my health, my home, my peace, my choices. Thomas's name wasn't there. I closed the notebook and placed it neatly beside my bills. The ache in my chest didn't vanish. But something inside me shifted, like a door closing gently, firmly, for good. And in that moment, I decided I'd stop expecting anything from him ever again. Sometimes pain teaches you to stand taller than you thought you could. After that day, I stopped waiting for Thomas's calls. The silence that once suffocated me started to feel like space to think, to heal, and to reclaim the parts of myself I had lost. It wasn't easy, but I realized that if I wanted peace, I had to stop depending on someone who'd made it clear I wasn't a priority. I began by organizing my bills, spreading them across the kitchen table like pieces of a puzzle. Instead of crying over them, I studied them. I made lists, called billing offices, and asked questions. One woman at the hospital's financial department suggested I apply for a low-income hardship plan. I had never thought of myself as low-income before, but swallowing my pride felt easier than drowning in debt. With Barbara's help, I filled out the paperwork. She even drove me to the clinic when my old car broke down. "You've taken care of everyone else your whole life," she said. "Let someone take care of you for a change." Her kindness steadied me. For the first time in months, I didn't feel completely alone. Soon after, I joined a small community support group for older adults dealing with medical debt. We met every Thursday at the library. At first, I just listened stories from widows, retirees, people who'd lost homes or family to financial hardship. It humbled me. I wasn't the only one hurting, and that truth brought strange comfort. One afternoon, a man named Walter shared how he negotiated his medical payments by writing a letter directly to the hospital board. His story inspired me. That night, I sat at my desk, my hands trembling slightly, and wrote my own letter explaining my situation honestly, detailing the years I'd served as a teacher, the loss of my husband, and the lack of family support. I asked for a review of my payment terms, not pity, just fairness. A week later, I received a response. The hospital approved a 40% reduction on my balance and allowed smaller monthly payments. When I read the letter, I felt tears sting my eyes. I hadn't expected a miracle, but it felt like one. From then on, I built small routines to regain control over my life. I started walking every morning slowly, at first, around the block. The cold air bit my cheeks, but it also filled my lungs with purpose. I planted new flowers in my garden, tended to them daily, and found solace in watching something grow under my care again. I also started tutoring local children online. A few parents from the community recommended me, and soon I was earning a modest income helping kids with reading and writing. The money wasn't much, but it gave me dignity. Each paycheck, however small, reminded me that I was still capable, still valuable. Evenings became peaceful again. I cooked simple meals, stews, baked potatoes, and warm bread. I turned off the television and spent more time reading. Sometimes, I'd paint by the window, mixing colors on an old palette I hadn't touched in years. Life became quiet, steady, and strangely full again. Barbara noticed the change in me. "You're glowing," she said one afternoon over tea. I laughed, brushing her compliment away. But deep down, I knew she was right. I was finally beginning to heal, not just from my illness, but from the heartbreak Thomas had caused. My doctor, too, was surprised by my progress. At my next appointment, he smiled and said, "You're doing remarkably well, Margaret. Keep this up, and you'll be stronger than ever." Hearing that made me feel lighter, like I was reclaiming parts of myself that had gone dormant under all the pain. Of course, there were still hard days. There were moments when loneliness crept in, when I'd see an old photo of Thomas and wonder if he ever thought about me. I'd imagine him laughing with Leah, maybe even complaining about his mother who needed too much. Those thoughts hurt, but I refused to let them consume me. Instead, I told myself something new. "You're not weak for needing help, you're strong for surviving without it." Months passed quietly. The seasons changed, the flowers in my garden bloomed and faded, and I learned to enjoy solitude. There was a strength in standing alone, in proving that I could endure what once seemed unbearable. Then one evening, as I sat in my favorite chair watching the sunset paint the sky pink and gold, I realized something profound. I no longer felt angry. The resentment that once burned inside me had dimmed to an ember. What replaced it was clarity. I didn't need Thomas to change for me to move forward. I just needed to accept who he was and who I was without him. I whispered to myself, "You did it, Margaret. You made it through." But as peace settled over me, life had a way of stirring the calm. A few weeks later, the phone rang late at night. I hesitated before answering, expecting it to be a wrong number or perhaps a telemarketer. But when I picked it up and heard the voice on the other end, my stomach dropped. It was Thomas. His tone was frantic, almost panicked. "Mom," he said, "I really need your help." But little did I know, Thomas's life was about to start crumbling in ways I never imagined. Karma doesn't always knock. Sometimes, it calls. It had been 6 quiet months since I'd heard from Thomas, long enough for me to stop expecting anything at all. But that night, when the phone rang, something in my chest told me this call was different. I hesitated before picking up, half afraid it would be bad news, and, in a way, it was. "Mom," he said, his voice trembling slightly, "I really need your help." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I had imagined this moment so many times, him finally calling, finally acknowledging me, but I never thought it would sound like desperation. I asked softly, "What's wrong, Thomas?" He sighed heavily. "It's everything. Leah lost her job a few months ago, and we've been struggling to keep up with bills. The mortgage is behind, the credit cards are maxed out, and now the bank's threatening to repossess the car." I blinked, unsure whether to feel pity or irony. This, I thought, was the same man who couldn't be bothered to pay a hospital bill for his mother. He went on, his words tumbling over each other. "I just need a loan, Mom. $10,000. Just until Leah finds work again. I promise I'll pay you back." My heart twisted. $10,000. The same son who couldn't spare a few hundred for my medication was now asking for thousands. I wanted to remind him of the months of silence, the unanswered texts, the hospital collectors, but I stayed quiet. Instead, I asked calmly, "Thomas, why are you asking me? You have friends, in-laws, savings." His tone grew defensive. We already borrowed from Leah's parents, and they're not helping anymore. I didn't know who else to turn to. The truth hit me then. He didn't call because he missed me. He called because he had no one left to use. Still, the mother in me hesitated. Part of me wanted to reach through the phone and comfort him, to remind him that I'd always been his safe place. But another part, the part that had cried through nights of rejection and disappointment, had grown stronger. "Thomas," I said quietly, "I don't have that kind of money anymore." There was a pause, then a sharp exhale. "Come on, Mom, don't say that. You've always had something saved. You've got the house, your pension." I felt my pulse quicken. "That money is for my living expenses," I said firmly. "I'm on a fixed income, and I can't risk losing my home." He scoffed. "You're acting like you're broke. You've always managed just fine." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence on the line was heavy, filled with years of unspoken words. I finally said, "Do you remember when I needed help, Thomas? When I was sick and you wouldn't even answer my calls?" He didn't reply. I could hear his breathing, shallow and quick. "I begged you," I continued, my voice trembling now. "Not for luxury, not for comfort, for survival. You ignored me. You told me to manage better. Now you're the one asking for help." He let out an exasperated sigh. "So what, this is payback? You're really going to hold a grudge?" I closed my eyes, feeling my heart ache. "It's not a grudge, it's a lesson. You showed me what happens when help isn't mutual. I learned to survive without you." He muttered something under his breath, then said, "Fine, I'll figure it out myself." And just like that, he hung up. The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone, my hands shaking slightly. It wasn't victory, I felt it was sorrow. The kind of sorrow that comes from realizing a relationship has withered beyond repair. Barbara stopped by the next morning and found me sitting at the table, staring into my tea. When I told her about the call, she didn't look surprised. "He's reaping what he's sown," she said bluntly. "And you did the right thing, Margaret. He's a grown man. You've carried him long enough." Her words gave me a strange sense of relief, but they also stirred something deeper resolve. That evening, I went to my desk and pulled out a small notebook. I flipped to a fresh page and wrote, "I will never let guilt dictate my choices again." For the first time, I realized how freeing it felt to say no. I wasn't being cruel, I was protecting myself. Over the next few weeks, Thomas didn't call. Not once. But I heard from mutual acquaintances that he and Leah were arguing often. Apparently, she had grown tired of the financial stress and was blaming him for mismanaging everything. There were even rumors that she had moved out temporarily to stay with her parents. Each story felt like a strange echo of my own experience with him, someone who took and took until people finally had nothing left to give. I didn't feel joy in his downfall, but I couldn't deny the sense of poetic justice. Life has a way of returning lessons in unexpected forms. One night, as I sat reading by the fire, I thought about how everything had come full circle. I had begged for help and been ignored. Now, he was the one begging, and I had learned the strength to say no. When I went to bed that night, I slept peacefully for the first time in a long while. The old ache in my chest was gone, replaced by calm certainty. I no longer felt powerless. I no longer felt small. For the first time in years, I felt in control of my own life. I hung up the phone, shaking but not from fear, from a strange, liberating power. Word travels fast in small towns, especially when it's soaked in family drama. In the weeks that followed Thomas's desperate phone call, I didn't hear from him again. At first, I thought perhaps he'd found a solution, that maybe his pride had kept him from admitting how bad things were. But in a small place like ours, secrets have short lives. Barbara was the one who first told me. She came over one morning with a basket of scones and that unmistakable look of someone who'd heard something they couldn't keep to themselves. "I probably shouldn't say this," she began. "But you know how small towns are." I smiled faintly. "Barbara, if you don't tell me, you'll explode," she sighed. "Well, a friend of mine saw Thomas at the bank last week. He was arguing with someone, apparently trying to get a loan. They turned him down." I felt an odd mix of sadness and disbelief. "He didn't tell me any of that." Barbara raised an eyebrow. Would you have helped if he had? I didn't answer. Over the next few days, more whispers drifted my way. Through mutual acquaintances, I learned that Leah and Thomas were in trouble, not just financial trouble, but emotional. Their fancy lifestyle had caught up to them. The luxury car payments, the remodeled kitchen, the vacations, it had all been borrowed peace. Leah's family had cut them off, calling Thomas irresponsible. Their marriage, it seemed, was hanging by a thread. I wanted to feel sorry for him. I really did. But the empathy was buried under something else, something sharper. Maybe it was justice. Maybe it was just exhaustion. Meanwhile, my own life began to find rhythm again. I woke early each morning to tend my garden, helped children with reading lessons in the afternoons, and spent evenings with Barbara watching old films. For the first time in years, my days were mine. But despite the calm, a thought began to take root in my mind, a thought about the future. What would happen to my home, my savings, my small pieces of joy when I was gone? It wasn't morbid, it was practical. I had spent my whole life preparing for others, but never once had I prepared for myself. So, I decided to do something I had put off for far too long. I called a lawyer. His name was Mr. Gaines, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes who'd handled estate work for several people I knew. I made an appointment and, a week later, sat across from him in his quiet office surrounded by bookshelves and the faint smell of lemon polish. "I'd like to update my will," I told him. He nodded and opened his notepad. "Do you already have one in place?" "Yes," I said. "But it was written years ago, back when I thought my son would take care of me." He smiled politely but didn't pry. "And what would you like to change?" I hesitated for a long moment, feeling the weight of the decision pressing down on me. Finally, I said, "I'd like to add a few charitable beneficiaries, and I'd like to name someone else as my executor, my friend Barbara." He wrote quickly, his pen scratching softly against the paper. "And your son?" I swallowed hard. "He remains my heir for now, but I'm not sure I want it to stay that way." Mr. Gaines nodded thoughtfully. "You don't have to decide today. We can draft a preliminary version and revisit it whenever you're ready." I thanked him, signed a few papers, and left feeling strangely lighter. For the first time, I'd taken a step toward protecting my future from being squandered by the very person I'd once trusted most. When I told Barbara, she smiled approvingly. "Good for you," she said. "It's not about revenge, it's about peace. Make sure your life's work ends up where it will be valued." Her words lingered. That night, as I sat by my window writing in my journal, I thought about all the people who had been kind to me lately, neighbors who brought groceries, church friends who helped with errands, children who drew me thank you pictures after tutoring sessions. Those were the people who appreciated what I had to give, not the son who only called when he needed something. Still, I didn't rush to change the will completely. A small part of me, however foolish, still hoped Thomas might wake up one day and realize what he'd done. I wanted to believe that people could change, even if experience told me otherwise. But life has a strange sense of timing. Because just when I began to consider forgiving him, something happened that erased any trace of hesitation. A few days later, I opened my mailbox and found a thick envelope with the hospital's letterhead. I frowned, confused. I thought I had settled everything months ago. When I tore it open and read the words inside, my hands began to tremble. It was another bill. A final balance I hadn't been told about. It wasn't a massive amount compared to before, but it was still more than I could easily pay. My insurance had apparently missed a portion of the coverage. I sat down at my kitchen table, staring at the paper as my chest tightened. I could handle this one last hurdle, but it would take careful budgeting. Still, part of me couldn't ignore the bitter irony, another medical bill, another test from life. I thought briefly about calling Thomas, but the thought passed as quickly as it came. He had made his priorities clear. This was my battle now. I folded the letter neatly, slid it into a drawer, and took a deep breath. And then, an unexpected letter arrived that made my decision for me. Life has a way of testing you one last time before you rise above it. When I opened that final notice from the hospital, I felt like life was laughing quietly in my face. I'd spent months rebuilding my peace, getting my finances in order, and convincing myself that the worst was behind me. But there it was again, one more reminder that no matter how hard you try to stand tall, life always finds a way to nudge you back to your knees. I set the letter down and took off my glasses. My eyes burned from exhaustion, not just from reading the fine print but from the familiar ache of frustration. It wasn't a huge amount, maybe a few $1,000s, but to me, it might as well have been a mountain. I called the billing office first thing the next morning. The woman on the line was polite but firm. "It looks like your secondary coverage didn't apply to that portion, Mrs. Henson," she explained. "You can either pay the balance in full or set up another payment plan." Another plan. Another chain. I thanked her, hung up, and stared at the wall. I'd been so proud of how far I'd come paying down debts, learning to budget, even saving a little for emergencies. But the idea of being trapped again under another round of payments made my stomach twist. Barbara came over that afternoon, bringing her usual comfort in the form of tea and empathy. When I told her about the bill, she frowned. "Margaret, that's not fair. You've done everything right. They can't keep adding more." "They can," I said quietly. "And they have." She reached across the table and took my hand. "Are you going to tell Thomas?" The question lingered in the air like smoke. I looked down at my cup. The steam had faded, leaving only ripples on the surface. "No," I said finally. "He's not my solution anymore." That night, after Barbara left, I sat at my desk under the dim glow of my lamp. The envelope from the hospital lay open beside me, along with another one, the draft of my new will. I had been meaning to make final changes. But now, as I looked between the two papers, something clicked. I realized this bill wasn't just a burden, it was clarity, a closing act, life's final way of asking, "Are you sure you've learned your lesson?" I had. The next morning, I called Mr. Gaines's office and asked if I could come in that week. He said he could fit me in Thursday morning. I thanked him and hung up with a calmness I hadn't felt in a long time. On Thursday, I dressed neatly in a navy cardigan and my late husband's gold locket. The drive to Mr. Gaines's office felt strangely ceremonial. The sky was clear, the air crisp, the kind of morning that made you feel both small and significant at once. When I sat down across from him, I smiled faintly and said, "I think I'm ready to finalize everything." He nodded, pulling out the file. "You mentioned last time that you wanted to include some charitable donations?" "Yes," I said. "I want to divide my estate among 3 local organizations: the Children's Literacy Fund, the Senior Care Foundation, and the Community Library. They've all given me something I can never repay." He wrote quickly, asking questions as we went. "And your executor remains your friend, Barbara?" "Yes." He hesitated, glancing up. "And your son?" I took a deep breath. "I'd like to remove him entirely." He paused his pen, giving me a long, searching look, as though making sure I was certain. "You understand what that means legally?" "I do," I said firmly. "Thomas has made his choices, and now I'm making mine." There was a weight in saying it aloud, final, irreversible, but also a deep sense of release. For years, I had built my life around my son's comfort, his success, his happiness. Now, I was finally building something for myself. We finished the paperwork, and Mr. Gaines handed me an envelope with the updated documents inside. "You've made very thoughtful choices, Mrs. Henson," he said. "Most people wait too long to protect what truly matters to them." When I walked out of his office, I felt light, almost untethered. I stopped at the park on the way home, sat on a bench under an oak tree, and let the breeze brush through my hair. I thought of Daniel, my late husband, how he used to tell me, "You're stronger than you think, Margaret." I smiled quietly, realizing he'd been right all along. When I got home, I made myself a cup of tea, the same kind Thomas used to love as a boy. I sat at the kitchen table, the will lying neatly beside me. I sealed it in a yellow envelope, signed across the flap, and placed it in my desk drawer. As I closed the drawer, a wave of peace washed over me. I wasn't angry anymore, not at Thomas, not at life, not even at the years I'd wasted hoping for something that never came. What I felt instead was freedom. Freedom from expectations. Freedom from disappointment. Freedom from the illusion that love should always be repaid. I didn't tell anyone about the new will. Not even Barbara. It was my quiet secret. My final act of self-respect. I glanced at the stack of unpaid bills one last time, then slid the hospital notice into the same drawer. I'd deal with it on my own, like I always had. But now, every choice I made came from strength, not survival. And as the morning sunlight filled my kitchen, I smiled for the first time in a long while, knowing that I had just rewritten the story of my life in the most unexpected way. The next morning, I sealed the envelope, knowing I'd just changed my son's future forever. Peace feels different when it's built on the ashes of your old expectations. The days following my visit to Mr. Gaines's office felt unusually still. The tension that had sat like a stone in my chest for months was gone. In its place was something quiet, something that felt a lot like freedom. I didn't tell a soul about what I'd done. Not Barbara, not the group at the library, no one. My secret sat safely tucked away in my desk drawer, sealed and waiting. Though I hoped it wouldn't need to be opened for many years. I'd written my own ending, and it was one I could finally live with. My health began to improve again. Dr. Wells was pleasantly surprised during my next checkup. "You seem lighter," he told me. "Whatever you're doing, keep it up." I smiled and told him I'd finally learned to let go of unnecessary stress. My mornings became something I looked forward to again. I'd make my tea, step out onto the porch, and watch the sunrise spill across the horizon. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of dew and blooming jasmine. I'd sit there in my robe, feeling like I'd reclaimed something sacred, my peace. I poured my time into small joys. Tutoring the neighborhood kids brought laughter back into my days. They reminded me of the classroom, years, the chalk dust, the giggles. The way learning lit up young eyes. They paid me a little. But the reward wasn't the money, it was purpose. Barbara and I had our weekly movie nights, complete with popcorn and commentary about how unrealistic old romances were. We laughed a lot, sometimes until we cried. She noticed my calm but didn't question it. Maybe she sensed that I'd found my own closure. Every now and then, though, I'd think of Thomas. I'd picture him sitting somewhere, scrolling through his phone, probably worrying more about his career than his marriage. Part of me still hoped he was okay, even if we were no longer in touch. The maternal instinct doesn't fade, no matter how deep the wound. Months rolled by quietly, each one softer than the last. The seasons shifted, the leaves turned amber and gold, and life became simple in the most beautiful way. One chilly autumn morning, I decided to redecorate. I moved old furniture around, donated clothes I no longer needed, and filled my home with little things that made me happy: fresh flowers, scented candles, soft blankets. It was like breathing new life into the space that had once felt heavy with loneliness. That afternoon, Barbara stopped by with a box of cookies. "You seem happy," she said, her eyes scanning the room. "It suits you." "I am," I replied honestly, for the first time in a long while. She grinned. "See? You didn't need him to find peace after all." She was right. I didn't. I had learned to stand without Thomas, without his validation or his promises. I had learned that peace isn't given, it's built. Piece by piece. Choice by choice. A few nights later, I found myself looking at an old photo of him again. He was maybe 8 or 9, missing a front tooth, standing in front of our Christmas tree holding the toy train Daniel had given him that year. His smile was wide. I ran my fingers across the picture and whispered, "Where did you go, my boy?" It wasn't anger or bitterness anymore, it was grief. The quiet kind. The kind that lingers after you've already accepted the loss. Time passed. Winter arrived with its long, slow evenings. I baked bread, knitted scarves, and spent afternoons at the library reading novels. Life was small, but it was mine, and I found comfort in its simplicity. Then, one night in late February, as the wind rattled the windows and the world outside lay wrapped in cold silence, I heard a sound that startled me: a knock at the door. It was almost 9 p.m. No one ever visited me that late. For a moment I thought it might be Barbara, but she always called first. My heart began to pound as I made my way to the door, my steps slow and cautious. When I opened it, I froze. Thomas stood there. He looked nothing like the confident man who'd once turned his back on me. His hair was unkempt, his clothes wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. He was shivering slightly, his breath visible in the cold night air. "Mom," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I stood still, gripping the edge of the doorframe. For a moment, neither of us spoke. I wanted to be angry, to demand answers, but all I felt was shock and something else I couldn't name. He looked so small, so lost. "I didn't know where else to go," he murmured finally. My throat tightened. I stepped aside slowly, gesturing for him to come in. He hesitated, then crossed the threshold. His shoulders slumped, his eyes filled with something I hadn't seen in years: humility. He sat down on the couch, staring at the floor. The room was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. I made tea, just like always, my hands trembling slightly as I set his cup down in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice cracked. "Leah left me." The words hung in the air, heavy and irreversible. Until one fateful night when Thomas showed up at my doorstep in tears. Sometimes people only come home when they've lost everything else. Thomas sat there on my couch, his shoulders slumped, staring blankly at the steam rising from his untouched cup of tea. The same tea I'd made him countless times as a boy, the one that used to calm his fears after nightmares or bad grades. Now, it sat untouched between us, a fragile bridge across years of silence and pain. I wanted to speak, but no words came. My throat felt tight, my mind a tangle of pity and restraint. He looked up at me finally, his eyes red and swollen. "She left me, Mom," he said quietly. "Leah packed her things and went to her parents' house 2 days ago. She said she was done." I nodded slowly, unsure how to respond. "I'm sorry, Thomas." He rubbed his face with both hands, exhaling shakily. "Everything's falling apart. We're behind on everything: the mortgage, the car, even the utilities. Leah blamed me for everything. Said I was irresponsible. Selfish. Maybe she's right." I didn't know what to say to that. The words irresponsible and selfish had echoed in my own thoughts for months, but hearing him admit it, hearing the weight in his voice, made something inside me soften and harden all at once. "I didn't want to come here," he continued, "but I didn't have anywhere else to go." Those words struck me deeply. They were both confession and insult. He hadn't wanted to come, but he'd come anyway. Because I was his last resort, not his first thought. I took a slow breath. "You can stay for a few days," I said quietly. "Until you figure out your next step." He nodded without looking up. "Thank you." That night, I made up the guest room. It was the same room he'd slept in as a teenager, the one with faded posters and scuff marks on the door. As I tucked in the sheets, I caught sight of an old photo on the shelf: Thomas at 12, smiling with a fishing pole, Daniel's arm around him. I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness, but from how distant that version of him felt. The first few days passed quietly. He slept late, stayed glued to his phone, and barely spoke at meals. I didn't push him. I knew shame had its own voice, and sometimes silence was the only language it spoke. But as days turned into weeks, I started to notice things. He wasn't looking for jobs like he said he would. He'd leave dishes in the sink, scroll endlessly on his phone, and snap when I asked small questions. One evening, I came home from tutoring to find him sprawled on the couch, eating takeout and watching television. The kitchen was a mess, and the trash was overflowing. I stood there, holding my bag, staring at him. "Thomas," I said softly, "I thought you were going to look into work today." He didn't look up. I did. "Nothing out there right now." "Did you check online?" He shrugged. "I'll get around to it." Something inside me clenched. You can't just sit here waiting for things to fix themselves. He turned then, annoyance flickering across his face. "Why are you on my back? I'm dealing with enough already." I stared at him, disbelief flooding through me. "You're living under my roof. eating my food, and not even trying, Thomas. I'm not your maid. His expression darkened. Wow. I come here for help and you throw that in my face? You've always been dramatic, Mom. That word dramatic cut deeper than he realized. I had been many things in my life, strong, loving, patient, but dramatic? No. That was just his way of deflecting guilt. I took a deep breath. Thomas, I'm not trying to fight. But if you're going to stay here, you need to take responsibility for your life. He looked away, muttering, Yeah, sure. I thought about how strange it was having him there, yet feeling lonelier than ever. I had dreamed of reconciliation for so long, but this wasn't healing. This was exposure. His behavior only confirmed what I had refused to see before, that the man sitting in my house was not the boy I had raised. Over the next few days, tension thickened like fog. He'd come and go without saying where, ignore my questions, and leave the lights on all night. Once, I found my checkbook slightly out of place on my desk. I didn't accuse him, but the unease in my stomach was unmistakable. Barbara stopped by and immediately sensed something was off. He's taking advantage of you, she warned. You can't let guilt make you blind again. I nodded but didn't answer. She was right, of course. I had spent my entire life giving him endless second chances, hoping that one of them might finally stick. But I was beginning to realize that forgiveness doesn't mean enabling. A week later, after yet another argument about his lack of effort, I finally said it. Thomas, I think it's time you start looking for another place to stay. He froze. You're kicking me out? I'm asking you to take responsibility. You can't stay here forever, pretending the world owes you another start. His face flushed with anger. You're unbelievable. After everything I've been through, after everything I did for you, this is how you treat me? I stared at him, stunned. Everything you did for me? I repeated softly. Thomas, when I was sick, you didn't even call. That silenced him. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came. He looked away, shame flickering across his face. And for the first time, I saw something real behind his pride fear. I sighed, the fight leaving me. You can stay a few more days, but after that you need to move on. He didn't argue. He just nodded once, his jaw tight, and left the room. Later that night, as I sat alone in the living room, I looked at the sealed will, tucked neatly in the desk drawer. For months, it had sat there quietly. A secret, waiting to speak. I hadn't planned on revealing it so soon, but after that argument, I knew it was time. I called Mr. Gaines the next morning and scheduled an appointment. It's time, I told him. I'd like my son to be present when the final version is read. When I hung up, my hands trembled, not with fear, but with certainty. And that's when I knew I had to let the truth come out. When the lawyer opened the envelope, Thomas's smirk said he thought he'd already won. The day of the meeting arrived on a gray Thursday morning. The sky looked heavy, like it was holding back rain. I woke early, my nerves humming quietly beneath my calm exterior. I made myself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table for a long while, staring at the envelope that held my truth. Barbara insisted on coming with me. You shouldn't have to face him alone, she said, ever protective, ever loyal. She wore her favorite maroon scarf, the one she always saved for important days. I smiled and thanked her, silently grateful for her presence. When we arrived at Mr. Gaines's office, Thomas was already there, leaning against the doorway, his phone in hand. He looked tired but tried to mask it with indifference. When he saw me, he put his phone away and straightened his jacket. Hey, Mom, he said casually, as though this were some routine. Appointment. Hello, Thomas, I replied, my voice steady. Mr. Gaines ushered us into the small conference room. The walls were lined with books, and a faint scent of paper and polish filled the air. Barbara sat beside me, her hand resting quietly on mine beneath the table. Thomas took a seat across from us, crossing one leg over the other, his posture a mix of confidence and impatience. Mr. Gaines cleared his throat. Thank you all for coming. Mrs. Henson asked that this meeting be held to review and finalize her last will and testament. Thomas smiled faintly. like a man waiting for a formality to pass. I could almost hear the unspoken thoughts behind his expression. Finally. About time. Mr. Gaines carefully broke the seal on the envelope and unfolded the document. His voice was calm and deliberate as he began to read. I, Margaret Henson, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. He went through the formalities, my personal details, the date, the witnesses before reaching the part that mattered. To my dear friend Barbara Reed, he read. I leave the contents of my art collection and a portion of my personal savings as a token of gratitude for her kindness, loyalty, and friendship, Barbara gasped softly, turning to me with wide eyes. I gave her a small smile. You deserve it, I whispered. Thomas shifted in his seat but said nothing. Mr. Gaines continued. To the following organizations, the Children's Literacy Fund, the Oak Ridge Senior Support Foundation, and the Community Library of Cedar Hill, I leave the remainder of my estate, to be divided equally among them. Thomas blinked, confusion flashing briefly across his face. He leaned forward slightly, as if he hadn't heard correctly. Wait, he said, interrupting. What about me? Mr. Gaines looked up from the document, his expression neutral. There is one final note addressed to you, Mr. Henson. He adjusted his glasses and read aloud. To my son, Thomas Henson, I leave the lesson of responsibility. I hope one day he understands that love is not measured in money, but in the choices we make when someone needs us most. The words hung in the air like a quiet bell. Thomas's face turned red. Is this some kind of joke? He snapped. You can't be serious. I looked at him calmly. I'm serious, Thomas. He scoffed. You're leaving everything to charities and your friend? After everything I've done for you? I felt the corners of my lips tighten, not in anger, but in restraint. Everything you've done for me? I repeated softly. Thomas, when I needed help, you ignored my calls. You left me to face debt collectors and hospital bills while you vacationed in Italy. That was when you showed me what you truly valued. His eyes darted between me and Barbara, disbelief turning into outrage. So this is revenge then? You're punishing me. No, I said firmly. This isn't revenge, this is consequence. There's a difference. He stood up, his voice rising. You can't do this to me. I'm your son. I met his gaze steadily. And I was your mother when you couldn't be bothered to care. Silence filled the room. Even Mr. Gaines paused, his pen hovering above the page. Thomas's breathing was heavy, his anger simmering just below the surface. Finally, he slammed his hand on the table. This is unbelievable. You've let that old woman, he shot a glare toward Barbara, talk you into this. Barbara straightened her shoulders. You're wrong, Thomas, she said coolly. Your mother doesn't need anyone to tell her what's right. She learned that the hard way on her own, Mr. Gaines interjected, his voice calm but firm. Mr. Henson, the documents are legally binding. Your mother has every right to distribute her estate as she sees fit. Thomas stared at him, his jaw clenched, then turned back to me. His eyes were full of disbelief and something else, betrayal maybe. But not the kind that came from love. It was the betrayal of entitlement denied. Fine, he said coldly. If that's how you want it, then I'm done. He stormed out of the office, the door slamming behind him. The sound echoed through the quiet room, sharp and final. Barbara exhaled slowly. Mr. Gaines set the papers aside and gave me a reassuring nod. You did the right thing, Mrs. Henson. Sometimes clarity costs courage. I sat there for a long moment, my hands folded in my lap. The silence that followed wasn't heavy like before. It was clean, pure, the kind of silence that follows closure. I turned to Barbara and whispered, For the first time in years, I don't feel afraid. Thomas stormed out, slamming the door behind him as silence filled the room. Freedom sometimes comes disguised as an ending. After that day at Mr. Gaines's office, the world felt strangely quiet. The weight that had pressed against my chest for months had lifted. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without guilt clinging to every breath. Barbara drove me home afterward. We didn't speak much, there wasn't anything left to say. The hum of the car engine filled the silence between us, and when we pulled into my driveway, she turned to me with that soft, knowing look she always had. "You did what needed to be done," she said gently. I nodded. "It doesn't feel like revenge, Barbara. It feels like peace." She smiled faintly. "That's how you know it's right." After she left, I stood in my living room, looking around at the quiet space that had witnessed so much heartache. I remembered sitting in that same spot months ago, surrounded by medical bills and tears. Now, those bills were paid, the debts were gone, and the only thing left was me standing on my own, finally free. The next few days were calm, almost eerily so. I half expected Thomas to come, back to call, to argue, to try to guilt me into changing my mind, but he didn't. There were no calls, no messages, no knocks at the door. It was as if he'd vanished from my world entirely. Word of the will, however, didn't take long to spread. In a small town like Cedar Hill, privacy is a luxury few can afford. Within a week, whispers reached me. People I barely knew came up to me at the grocery store with curious expressions. "I heard you left everything to charity," one woman said, her tone more surprised than judgmental. "That's brave. Brave or foolish," another muttered nearby, not realizing I could hear her. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't explain or justify my decision. Let them talk. They hadn't lived my life, hadn't cried in the dark wondering how their only child could turn away so easily. They didn't know the peace that came from finally taking control. Barbara, as always, was my fortress. She told anyone who pried to mind their own business. "Margaret made her choice," she'd say sharply. "And if you knew what she went through, you'd call it strength, not spite." Her loyalty touched me deeply. She'd been my constant when everything else fell apart. I sometimes wondered how different things might have been if Thomas had even a fraction of her heart. Weeks passed, and life settled into a steady rhythm again. I started volunteering more at the library, helping children with reading programs. Their laughter filled the halls, echoing with the same warmth I'd once known in my classroom. Some days, I even stayed late, sorting books and sipping tea while the sun dipped below the horizon. Everywhere I went, people started to notice the change in me. The cashier at the market once said, "You look lighter, Mrs. Henson." "I suppose I am," I told her. I stopped carrying things that weren't mine to carry. It was the truth. One afternoon, I made a big decision. I sold the house. The home I'd built with Daniel, the place where I raised Thomas, where every wall held a memory. It wasn't an impulsive choice, it was a deliberate one. The house had become too big, too quiet, and I wanted something that reflected the woman I'd become, not the one who was waiting to be rescued. I bought a small cottage on the edge of town. It was cozy, surrounded by trees and wildflowers, the kind of place where peace felt like a daily visitor. Barbara helped me move, laughing the whole time about how little I actually owned now. "See, you've downsized your life," she said, lifting a box, "and somehow, it's bigger than ever." She was right. I decorated the cottage simply soft colors, family photos, and paintings I'd made during my recovery. It wasn't luxurious, but it was home. Every morning, I woke to birdsong and sunlight streaming through lace curtains, and I thought, this is what contentment feels like. Letters began arriving a few months later from the organizations I'd left my estate to. They were thank you notes, filled with words of gratitude and stories of how donations like mine helped fund literacy programs and senior care. I read each one carefully, tears prickling at my eyes. My life's work, my sacrifices were finally going somewhere meaningful. And yet, beneath the peace, a quiet ache lingered. Motherhood doesn't come with an off switch. No matter how much I tried to let go, part of me still wondered about Thomas. Was he okay? Was he angry? Did he ever think about me? Sometimes I'd catch myself glancing at my phone, half expecting it to ring. It never did. Then, one morning in early spring, as I returned from the post office, I noticed an envelope in my mailbox with handwriting I hadn't seen in years. My heart stopped. The name in the corner said it all, Thomas Henson. I froze, the letter trembling slightly in my hands. My first instinct was to tear it open right there on the porch, but my fingers wouldn't move. I stood for a moment, the cool breeze brushing against my face, the sound of birds filling the silence. Finally, I went inside, sat at the kitchen table, and stared at the envelope for a long time. Whatever was inside, I knew it would stir everything I had tried so hard to make still. But one letter from Thomas changed everything again. His handwriting was shaky, the words full of remorse. For several minutes, I just stared at the envelope on my kitchen table. My name, Mom, was written in the same looping scrawl Thomas had used when he was a boy signing birthday cards. The sight of it stirred something deep inside me, something fragile and old. I ran my thumb across the edge of the envelope, debating whether I should open it. What could he possibly have to say after all this time? Apology? Anger? Or another plea for money? My stomach twisted at the thought. Finally, I took a deep breath and tore it open. The paper inside was slightly crumpled, as though it had been handled too many times before it found its way to me. I unfolded it carefully, my heart pounding. It began simply, "Dear Mom, I don't know how to start this. I've written and thrown away at least 10 versions of this letter, but none of them felt right. I guess there's no right way to apologize for the kind of son I've been." My eyes stung immediately. I read on, my fingers trembling. "You were right about everything. About Leah, about my spending, about how I treated you. I see it now, clearer than ever. When things started falling apart, I kept blaming everyone else, my boss, the economy, Leah, life itself. But deep down, it was me. It was always me." I paused, pressing the paper to my chest as my breath caught. I wasn't prepared for this, not for honesty, not for regret. I think back to when you were sick and needed help, and I ignored you. I told myself you'd be fine, that you were strong, that you didn't really need me. The truth is, I didn't want to face the guilt. I was too selfish, too afraid of inconvenience, too wrapped up in myself. Each line felt like a confession pulled straight from the past I'd tried to bury. "You gave up everything for me, Mom. Dad's death should have broken us, but you didn't let it. You worked yourself to the bone so I could have opportunities you never did. And how did I repay you? By vanishing the moment you needed me most." Tears blurred the ink as I read the next part. "When you changed your will, I was furious. I told myself you were cruel, that Barbara had manipulated you, that you didn't love me anymore. But I get it now. You weren't punishing me, you were teaching me. You were showing me what responsibility actually means. It just took losing everything to finally understand it." I pressed my hand to my mouth, the sob that escaped both painful and freeing. "Leah's gone for good. The house is being repossessed. I'm living in a small apartment now, just me and my thoughts. It's quiet here too, quiet sometimes, but maybe that's what I need. I've started volunteering at a local food bank. It's not glamorous, but it feels honest. For once, I'm doing something that matters, something that isn't about me." I smiled faintly through tears. That was the first thing I'd heard from him in years that made me proud. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed to tell you that I finally see what you've been trying to teach me all along. Love isn't about taking, it's about giving. You gave me everything, Mom. And I gave you nothing when it counted most." I wiped my eyes, barely able to see the last few lines. "I don't want your money. I don't care about the inheritance. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly, deeply sorry. I don't know if I deserve another chance, but I hope you're happy. I hope you're healthy. And I hope you can forgive me. Love, Thomas." When I finished reading, I set the letter down and just sat there, staring at it through tear-filled eyes, the silence of my little cottage wrapped around me like a soft blanket. My emotions were tangled sadness, relief, and something that felt like long overdue closure. He had finally said the words I never thought I'd hear. "I'm sorry." I folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. My hands shook as I reached for a pen and a clean sheet of paper. I didn't want to overthink my reply. I just wrote from the heart. "Dear Thomas, thank you for your letter. It took courage to write it, and I want you to know I see that. I forgive you. Not because what you did was small, it wasn't, but because holding on to anger has no place in the life I've built now. I am happy, Thomas. I am peaceful. And I hope one day, you will be too. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past, but it allows us both to move forward. That's all I've ever wanted, for both of us to find peace. Love, Mom. It was short, but it said everything that needed saying. When I sealed the envelope, I pressed it against my chest for a moment before slipping it into my purse. The next morning, I mailed it. As the envelope disappeared into the slot, I felt something inside me release. The pain that had lingered for years began to dissolve, not because Thomas had changed the past, but because I no longer needed him to. That night, I slept soundly. For the first time in decades, my dreams were quiet. No guilt, no regret, just peace. When I woke the next morning, the sun was rising through my window, painting the sky in soft gold and lavender. I stood there for a long time, letting the light warm my face, knowing that something inside me had healed. And as I mailed it, I realized forgiveness was the true inheritance I'd left him. I used to believe revenge meant watching someone suffer, but now I know it means reclaiming your power. Months passed after I mailed my reply to Thomas. Life moved on quietly, but differently, lighter, softer, more whole. I had forgiven him, truly forgiven him, and that act had freed me in ways I didn't know forgiveness could. Each morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through lace curtains and the sound of birds outside my window. My days were simple: tea in the morning, walks in the garden, laughter with Barbara, tutoring sessions with the children at the library. Life no longer felt like something to survive. It felt like something to live. Sometimes, when I'd sit on my porch in the evenings, I thought about Thomas. Not with bitterness anymore, but with a kind of distant warmth. The way you think of someone who once hurt you but also helped you grow. His letter had been more than an apology, it had been a turning point for both of us. One crisp autumn afternoon, I received another letter from him. This time, the handwriting was steadier. Inside was a short note. Mom, I got your letter. Thank you for forgiving me, for loving me even when I didn't deserve it. I'm doing better now. I got a steady job managing a local community program. It's not much, but it feels right. I've learned more in the past few months than I did in all my years chasing success. I just wanted you to know I'm proud to be your son again. Love, Thomas. Tears welled in my eyes as I read it. He didn't ask for anything. He didn't make excuses. He simply shared his growth, his humility. That was enough. A week later, I agreed to meet him for coffee at a little cafe downtown. I almost didn't recognize him when he walked in. The arrogance that once lived in his stride was gone. He looked older, not from age, but from lessons learned the hard way. When he saw me, he smiled, not the forced, polite smile I'd seen at the lawyer's office, but a real one. Hi, Mom, he said softly. Hi, sweetheart. We sat by the window, sunlight pouring over the table. The air between us wasn't heavy anymore. We talked about ordinary things: his job, the people he helped, the apartment he'd made into a home. He asked about my health, about Barbara, about the library kids. For the first time in years, our conversation felt easy, natural. At one point, he looked down, fiddling with his cup. I still think about the will, he said quietly. I know I don't deserve a cent of what you worked for, but I just want you to know I understand why you did it. I would have done the same thing. I reached across the table and placed my hand over his. Thomas, I said gently. It was never about money. It was about love. About teaching you to value what can't be bought. He nodded, his eyes glistening. You did. I just took too long to learn it. We sat in silence for a while after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because words felt unnecessary. The peace between us said enough. When it was time to leave, he hugged me, really hugged me. Not the half-hearted, distracted kind of embrace from before, but one that felt genuine, grounded, full of gratitude. I love you, Mom, he whispered. I love you too, Thomas. As he walked away, I watched him blend into the busy street, and for the first time, I didn't feel the familiar ache of loss. I felt closure. Life continued, steady and kind. Barbara and I often spent evenings reminiscing, both of us grateful for the strange turns life had taken. Sometimes she teased, "You know, Margaret, you might have just written the world's longest moral lesson." I'd laugh and reply, "Maybe so. But at least this one had a happy ending." One golden afternoon, as autumn deepened, I walked through my garden, now bursting with color orange marigolds, pink dahlias, white lilies. The air was crisp, and the sun felt warm against my skin. I knelt to water the flowers and thought about all the seasons I'd survived, the winters of loneliness, the storms of disappointment, droughts of silence. Each one had led me here to a place of quiet strength. Inside my cottage, the sealed envelope containing my will still sat in my desk drawer. I hadn't changed it, and I didn't plan to. The Charities and Barbara would still inherit everything. That decision had built the foundation of my peace, and I had no reason to undo it. But what Thomas inherited was far more valuable. He had gained back his integrity, his humility, his sense of purpose. And I had gained back my freedom from guilt, from resentment, from the heavy expectations that once defined motherhood. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood by my window, watching golden light spill across the trees. My reflection stared back at me, not the tired, heartbroken woman I once was, but someone stronger, wiser, whole. I whispered softly to the empty room, "You did it, Margaret. You found your peace." And as the first stars began to appear in the evening sky, I smiled. Because in the end, the real inheritance was freedom from disappointment, from guilt, and from pain.